Welcome everyone to this AVERT webinar. My name is Matteo. I am senior lecturer at Deakin University and member of AVERT. Today we discuss a very topical issue about reliability and validity of risk tools for violent radicalization. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the unceded land on which I am today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I would like to pay my respect to elders past and present. Our speaker today is Sébastien Brouillette-Alarie. Sébastien is an adjunct professor at the School of Criminology at the University of Montreal, and he is the scientific coordinator of the Canadian Practitioners Network for the Prevention of Radicalization and Extremist Violence, CPN-PREV. I think many of us know the network well. His areas of expertise are risk assessments, firstly as a methodologist and in the field of prevention of sexual violence, and now in violent radicalization. Since 2017, Sébastien has coordinated multiple systematic reviews on various topics related with preventing violent extremism. They go from online radicalization, primary and secondary intervention programs, tertiary prevention programs, and trajectories into violent radicalization. Along with the CPN-PREV team, he's currently doing a Campbell collaboration systematic review on risk assessment in the field of violent radicalization, which is what Sébastien will be talking about today. Just one housekeeping note: the chat is not enabled, but you can ask questions in the Q&A using the Q&A button. I will moderate the Q&A, so if there are similar questions, I will try to merge and prioritize the first questions I get. So over to you, Sébastien. Thank you for coming and presenting today.
My pleasure. I will try to share my screen. So let's hope that it is working for everybody. So thanks for being here. I am glad to be here, and I'll hope I won't make a fool of myself. I am presenting today the results of a systematic review of the reliability and validity, so basically the psychometric properties of risk tools that assess the risk of violent radicalization. This systematic review was done by mostly CPN-PREV employees, of which I am, and in collaboration with the Campbell collaboration, as well as Public Safety Canada, which act as our overlords. So the question that we're going to ask ourselves is the evidence base solid based on the reliability and validity of these tools? You can find the protocol of this systematic review on the Campbell website, freely accessible, as all Campbell reports are, I think. However, the final paper is not out yet. We are hoping to finish it in the coming 2 to 3 weeks, but this will be our first submission, which will then probably get trashed by reviewers. So we can expect a publication process, let's say in 2024. Let's hope for the first half, but basically the protocol can be found on the online Campbell website. So let's start by talking about the potential pitfalls and advantages of risk assessment in the PVE field. So earlier this year, in the month of May, I've had the privilege of being invited to the Canada Centre 2023 conference, in which a bunch of practitioners, researchers, deciders from the PVE field were invited. And a bunch of topics and presentations were discussed. And among these, some presentations were related to risk assessment. And being an attendee to the conference, I've had the opportunity to kind of have an overview of how practitioners mostly perceive risk assessment in the field. And even though some would maybe like to say that people have a prudent optimism towards risk assessment in the field, it's more about straight up wariness. People are well, let's say, wary of the potential pitfalls of risk assessment in the field. So I've kind of documented my impressions. This is a very qualitative process, unlike the rest of what I'm going to present. But here's what people had to say about risk assessment in the Mega Week. So first of all, many perceive risk assessment to be seen to be linked to security actors and forced selective incarceration or pre-crime screening, which has already been done in the past by some governments. I would say that it depends. Indeed, risk assessments can be used for selective incarceration or pre-crime screening, but ideally it would not be used for that. And the use of risk assessment really depends on the correctional landscape. So for example, in Canada, risk assessment is used a lot with people that commit offenses. However, it has been used mostly to anchor the treatment program, the rehabilitative approach, that is the clinical interventions. So it kind of depends in which part of the world you are as to what people are going to do with risk assessment procedures. Some also said that tools that provide a risk score without case formulation are useless for clinical practice. And of course, I kind of agree with that. That does mean that second generation tools, which would be pure actuarial scales that are mostly static, would indeed not be useful for the field. But however, we have to think that more recent assessment tools, what is called fourth gen tools, such as the LSCMI, are defined by their integration of case formulation sections. There's a section about the risk assessment, and then there's a whole other section on how you're going to do treatment planning based on the results of the risk assessment that you have just done. And structured professional judgment tools not only give a lot of leeway to the clinician, but also should have, in terms of best practice, a case formulation section. And looking at the research of the last 40 years in the broader field of criminology, what we see is that if you want your correctional intervention to be effective, you have to rely on some principles, which are the risk, needs, and responsivity principles. And to respect these principles, you kind of have to anchor treatment formulation in a reliable and valid dynamic assessment of the risk. However, I'm talking about the broader field of criminology, not necessarily the PVE field. Practitioners also talked about fear that using tools could lead to stigmatization of certain populations or communities, namely because of risk overestimation. And concerns of tools being culturally valid are certainly of relevance. If we look at what has been done in the actuarial scale development in criminology, again, in the broader field of criminology, the last 5 to 10 years were massively focused on testing whether the tools that we use are culturally valid with communities and populations. Some are straight up not. However, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that tools can be, of course, culturally biased, but assessors can also be culturally biased. And when you use unstructured clinical judgment, all of your personal biases can be poured into the evaluations, which tools could potentially help to avoid, but not certainly. So the concern of stigmatization has to be taken, has to be thought in terms of tools, but also of what can happen if you do not use any tool. And about overestimation, one thing that is often not mentioned, maybe enough, is that when you compare unstructured clinical judgment with using tools, you are way more likely to overestimate risk with using unstructured clinical judgment than using tool because of the base rate problem. Maybe that if you're an assessor, you will just by routine think that about one case on 3 is high risk, 1 on 4 should be high risk. But actually, if the base rate of the phenomenon you're assessing risk for is 2%, 1 case on 50 should be assessed as high risk. So often knowledge of the base rate is important, and assessors that do not use any tool or have any base rate in mind often overestimate risk more than they underestimate it. Another thing that was mentioned is that risk tools are deprofessionalizing and irrelevant for trained clinicians. And this does suggest that structured professional judgment tools, which are ways to structure clinical judgment but are way less rigid than actuarials, would lead to better implementation than pure actuarials. And again, if we look at the broader field of criminology, there are countless studies that talk about how assessors are not keen about using actuarials, but way more receptive to structured professional judgment tools. The good news is that in the PVE field, all of the tools that are on which there are studies are SPG tools and not actuarials. There are 0 actuarials now in the field. The training landscape also has to be taken into consideration, which is that not every sector can employ experienced clinicians that know the risk and protective factors that are empirically related to violent extremism, that know the recent literature that was produced and have clinical expertise. If we could always employ such clinicians or assessors, that would be great, but some sectors actually cannot because of budget or availability of workforce purposes. And then in a lot of fields, the tool is actually the training material. So we also have to think about that when we say that yeah, of course, for up-to-date clinicians in their field, tools may not be useful. Yeah, that is indeed true, but not only experienced clinicians will do risk assessments in the world, unfortunately. The last thing that was mentioned is that risk prevention is the goal, not risk prediction, again, with which I wholeheartedly agree. Risk tool use should be for treatment formulation, treatment planning, case planning, not for monitoring populations without any legal mandate, which is known as like pre-crime screening. And the field is kind of a, let's say, it's normal that the field is actually stressed by that, because there were instances in which governments used a preliminary revision of risk tools to do pre-crime screening of individuals that did not commit any crime. And obviously that has that can lead to a lot of problems ethically and otherwise. So the fear of the practitioners in the field is kind of valid in this case. It has been done, unfortunately, by the past. But let's say that all of these ethical, implementation, practical questions, one question actually predates all of that, which is, among the risk tools that are available for violent radicalization, is there any that is reliable or valid? I mean, if we want to think about the advantages and potential costs of using tools, that is, yes, if tools are reliable and valid. If none of these tools are, the case is closed. We should just not use them. So predating all these debates that are really of interest, let's be clear here, we have to ask ourselves the questions: what are the reliability and validity of violent radicalization risk tools? As part of the mapping team of CPN-Prev, the mapping team has done a survey of Canadian practitioners, and the survey revealed that many of them were open to using risk tools to structure their clinical thoughts. Unfortunately, they were unsure of which tool to use and in which context, because basically no recommendations right now exists. Also, the costs associated with misevaluating risk are numerous. If you underestimate risk, then it can lead to premature release of dangerous individuals and new victims. If you overestimate risk, then it can lead to excess surveillance, stigmatization, longer than necessary sentences, and actually waste of funds on intervention that can be iatrogenic. And risk overestimation is of particular concern in the PVE field because base rates are so low, which means that there's a higher risk of false positives. So this led us to do a systematic review whose objective was to gather, critically appraise, and synthesize evidence about the level of psychometric validation of tools that assess the risk of violent radicalization. So we look at different types of reliability and validity. In terms of reliability, we looked at inter-rater agreement, at internal consistency. In terms of validity, we looked at content validity, so do the risk and protective factors or items in the scales fit with our knowledge about the drivers of violent extremism. Convergent validity, for example, do two similar tools with similar objectives converge or correlate? Discriminant validity, can a tool for VE discriminate between two individuals, one on a violent radical trajectory and the other one that is not? Predictive validity, which is like the main criterion for risk tool validation, which is, does the tool actually predict the outcome it is purposed or that is purposed to predict? If you have a risk tool that aims to predict criminal recidivism, then it should, with a certain amount of certainty, predict criminal recidivism. So, as I said, for risk tool validation, predictive validity is kind of the big one. If you don't have that one, you may have inter-rater agreement. If the tool doesn't predict what it is purposed to predict, we have a big problem. And finally, we have construct validity, and what we put in that is mostly studies of the dimensional structure of a tool, so factor analyses, multidimensional scaling analyses, and stuff like that. We aim to answer the following question based on the psychometric properties of a tool as validated in specific populations and context. Is a tool fit for purpose for use in such populations and context? We also wanted to document the landscape of violent extremism risk tool evaluation research. We wanted to see which tools were evaluated, what are the methodological designs that are most commonly used, what types of samples are used, what types of outcomes, for example, for predictive validity studies are used, and what are the major limitations of these studies, otherwise known as threats to validity. Here's our inclusion and exclusion criteria. So we only included risk tools specifically designed to assess the risk of violent radicalization. This means that we excluded tools not designed to assess the risk of violent radicalization, but that were used, for example, for a test on violent radical individuals. So there were one or two studies, for example, that tried to apply, if my memory serves me right, the MMPI or the HCR20 to individuals on violent radical trajectories to see if the tool could be useful or relevant. But in this case, in our systematic review, we only included tools specifically designed to assess the risk for violent radicalization. Tools also had to be operationally usable by clinician for individual cases. That means that scales for research purposes only without an interview or coding manual were excluded. Also, tools that are not made to assess individual risk were also excluded. There are tools that assess the risk of a building being targeted by, for example, a terrorist strike. In that case, it was not eligible because it was not about an individual risk. And tools that require large social media databases to function were also excluded because assessors and clinicians do not have such databases to do their analyses. And as part of the review process of the protocol, one of the reviewer, which we shall not name, because actually it was a blinded review, so I really don't know who it is, recommended that we exclude self-revealed psychometric scales such as the activism and radicalism intention scales. So basically scales that the person score by themselves rather than a clinician scoring the tool after an assessment. And I would kind of agree with that anonymous reviewer, because if you're trying to assess risk, you don't only want to ask the person that is whose risk is being assessed, how they perceive themselves as risky or not. You have to have the clinical input on that. So the self-revealed psychometric scales were excluded. We only included studies with primary data, but also looked through secondary data studies such as literature reviews to see if we missed any reference or relevant study. We only included quantitative studies and excluded qualitative or non-empirical papers. However, I would say that since we were looking at the reliability and validity of stools, most of the studies were quantitative in nature. So we didn't mince on much, considering the topic of interest. It does not mean that qualitative studies are uninteresting. On the contrary, of course. We included studies with the outcomes that interested us, in this case, reliability and validity of risk tools. And we only included studies, in fact, we included studies published before 2022. So our end date was December 31st, 2021, which means that any study published in 2022 or more will not be in this review, although we're going to talk about that later. So some methodological notes, the inter-rater agreement for the selection of articles, so eligible or not. We had a Fleiss kappa of 0.75, which is a substantial agreement. So good job us. However, that was post-training. The pre-training results were not as rosy. That, we try to do inter-rater agreement before training, or after initial training, see that it is not up to what we would like it to be. So we do more training. So actually doing inter-rater agreement enabled us to see that there was a lack in training, which we corrected after that. So then once articles were thematically eligible after full text reading, they had to go through a methodological quality assessment, which is known as a risk of bias tool. And this was done through a modified version of the Cosmin checklist. And we decided to exclude any studies whose Cosmin score was under 50%, which led to the exclusion of 2 studies because of their lack of methodological robustness, or at least details reported in the manuscript. This leads us to the known PRISMA statement, the very popular and lengthy to-do PRISMA statement. So we did a first search that encompassed papers up to November 2020, which gave us around 5,000 records. And then our Campbell overlords asked us to do a search update to, first of all, include manuscripts published until December 2021. And then we also added some keywords, which added 5,000 more papers. And then our overlords from Public Safety Canada asked us to do a search for specifically German literature, so which we did. So we got in touch with our German colleagues, which were amazing and incredibly effective. And they did the German literature search, which led to around 600, 700 more records, for a total of around 11,000 records. On these, around 120 were eligible based on title and abstract reading. However, this at the time included psychometric scales. So after it was suggested by a reviewer to leave these out, a bunch of them went out, which means that after full text reading and the reviewer suggestion, we had 20 eligible studies. And as I said earlier, 2 unfortunately did not survive the methodological screening. So 18 studies in total. here you have the results of these studies, and for those that might be quite astute, there are 19 studies. That's because we have a manuscript that contains multiple studies, but still 18 manuscripts, 19 studies. So we had 2 studies about the ERG-22 plus by Powys and colleagues, and these studies were quite sophisticated in that it was one of the only studies that used official interviews and records as a way to collect data rather than convenience samples, which result from the triangulation of publicly available data, which is going to be essentially, if you look at the next slide, this is most of our results. Nearly all of the studies were based on publicly available data. However, nothing on predictive validity for the ERG-22 plus, only reliability or construct validity. On the IVP guidance, there's one study by Egan and colleagues, which looks at internal consistency, inter-rater agreement, discriminant, and predictive validity, however, in a retrospective design. So we are going to have some predictive validity study, but all of the predictive validity studies were done using retrospective rather than prospective designs. And if one thing is known in tool validation, is that it is much harder to find satisfactory psychometric indices once you're using true prospective designs rather than retrospective coding of data. On the MLG or the MLG v2, one study, Hart and colleagues 2017, which look at inter-rater agreement, convergent and consent validity. On the VERA, we have one study, which is Birdsley and Beach in 2013. And then you have a bunch of studies on the TRAP-18, which is the tool on which there were by far the most studies. So here we have case studies in which they look at one perpetrator and see if, let's say, the TRAP-18 captured the risk of the person that has done a radicalized violence act. So we have 3 studies with 1 participant, which are the case studies. We have some studies about predictive validity, around 6 or 7, if my counting in real time is accurate, and a bunch of other. But basically, TRAP-18 is the tool on which there are the most studies. But again, even if there are predictive validity studies, no studies with a prospective design, only retrospective coding of the TRAP-18 on a sample that is the result of publicly available data. So what do I mean by that, for example, is building a terrorist database with cases that are known and mediatized by looking at newspaper articles, Google searches, bibliographies, and stuff to actually score the TRAP-18 and look for the outcome of interest. About that, the most often reported outcome for predictive validity studies was the commission of violence or not. So would that individual go on to commit violence, yes or no? But in a retrospective design, as always. So this leaves us to a picture of the landscape of VE risk assessment. So all of the study tools were structured professional judgment tools. No actuarials were found. So there was 2 studies. There were 2 studies on the ERG-22 plus, 1 on the IVP guidance, 2 on the MLG and updates, 1 study on the VERA, and 13 studies on the TRAP-18. As mentioned, only the IVP guidance and TRAP-18 have predictive validity studies. But as I said, nearly all of these predictive validity studies are with convenience samples assembled to the triangulation of publicly available data. And none of these studies use predictive in the prospective design, which is theoretically what is needed to have a true predictive validity study. As I said, the outcomes are mostly would the radicalized individual go on to commit violence or not. There was one quite interesting study by Garcia Andrade and colleagues in 2019, which is the only predictive validity study that, yes, was retrospective, but was based on official records rather than publicly available data. However, it was an exploratory studies in which they applied the track 18 to homeless persons with severe mental illness, and they checked whether these persons would go on to commit violently radicalized violence during the follow-up. So that was that was an interesting one. But then again, even though that study is among the most sophisticated predictive validity study that we have right now, it was not specifically on a violent radical individual. It was kind of a test driving for, as I said, people without a home and with severe mental illness. On average, the samples were of 60 participants, but the standard deviation was really, really large around that. So it went for, there were samples of one, and the largest one was near 200 persons. These samples are mostly constituted of men and sometimes comprise the small number of women. So all of the studies in parentheses contain some amount of women. However, we're talking about, hey, we have this sample of 175 individuals, of which 7 are women. So we don't really have a good picture of the validity and reliability of risk tools as it relates to women individuals. Surprisingly, I would say the type of extremist ideology was very varied. Whereas, as Matteo said earlier, we did in the last 4 years some amount of systematic reviews, some of which were on primary and secondary prevention programs. And in that systematic review, one of the things that was found is that like most of the prevention programs were made for religiously inspired violent extremism. So we kind of anticipated that it would be the same for risk tool validation, but actually not at all. There are as many validation studies on individuals on religiously inspired violent extremism than there are on far-right groups. And there are even samples with far left, individuals on the far left. So for example, environmental radicalization. So it was really varied. The validation studies, at least, did not seem to be specific to any type of ideology. Let us zoom on some aspects of the reliability and validity. So let's zoom on inter-rater reliability, predictive validity, and content and convergent validity. So in terms of inter-rater reliability, which means will to assessor risk similar, will to assessor have a similar risk scores if they assess the same individual or same items for the same individual. We have one study about the ERG22+, in which they tried to, they actually split their sample. So first of all, they tested the inter-rater reliability for researchers, and they found a really, really high inter-rater reliability. And then they also had a sample of practitioners, so individuals that were recently trained to use the tool. And the results that they found were like not bad, but less enthusiastic than what they found in like researchers and authors, basically, of the manuscript. So there's a question to the applicability of these very good inter-rater reliability to real life setting, which when the raters are not like the researchers that are conducting the evaluation and writing the study. So the IVP guidance reported a kappa of 0.80, which is very good, but again, made by research assistants and or authors and not like in the field assessors. MLGV2 intra-class correlation coefficient of 0.95, Vera with a kappa of at least 0.76 for the items. And then the TRAP18, we have some data that also indicate good inter-rater reliability. So overall, the interrogator reliability of these tools seemed to be quite high and in line with standards in criminology, psychology, and stuff like that. But then again, it seemed to come from like interrogator agreement when checking on the main research assistants, by checking on the main authors, and it remains to be seen how it will play out like in the wild with recently trained practitioners. But we can hope for good. In terms of predictive validity, unfortunately, it's kind of all over the place. So we have one study about the IVP guidance in which there are AUCs that vary depending on the group and outcome. So they tested the predictive validity with different groups, so different ideologies and different outcomes. So for example, bombings and then suicide attack and just radicalized violence. And depending on the group and outcome, the predictive validity coefficient really varied. So we had AUCs between 20.28 and 1. And so the 0 in AUC is at 0.50. So 0.50 means pure chance. 1 means perfect prediction, and 0 means perfect prediction, but in the opposite direction. So in that case, we had if we actually did the average of the AUCs, which you should not do officially, but that's like for presentation purposes. Don't do that in your papers. You're going to get flagged by reviewers. So the mean AUC of the Egan et al. Study was around 0.50, which is quite low. Not worse than chance, but quite low. And then on the TRAP-18, it also varied a lot. So we have 2 studies with really, really good AUCs and like suspiciously good AUCs, I would say. So we have the Buckler et al. Studies with the 0.88 AUC, which is really, really high. But also, it is easier to attain high AUCs when you have not a lot of participants in the sample. Once you go with a lot of participants and a lot of person in the offending and non-offending group, then it gets harder to have really high AUCs. And to give you an idea, in criminology, for example, looking at tools such as the static 99R or the LSCMI, we have AUCs that pretty much cap out around 0.75. Some tools in some really in studies that make the tool look good can reach around 0.80. There are some LSCMI studies that report an AUC of 0.80, but it's like about the highest of what we can find in the field. So finding AUCs of 0.88 and 1 is kind of a not suspicious, but actually linked to the low number of individuals in a sample. And let's make a little stats course. What the AUC of 0.88 means is that if you draw randomly a recidivist and draw randomly a non-recidivist, there is an 88% chance that the recidivist will have a higher TRAP-18 score than the non-recidivist. So in the case of Garcia Andrade et al., which had 44 participants, 2 of which reoffended, that means that the 2 participants that reoffended actually had the highest TRAP-18 score in the whole sample. But since the sample was of 44, I mean, it's a good news, but there's still questions about the generalizability, so hard to pronounce, of these results. So we had Chalakam and Lucas, which had a Cohen's d of 1.70 for predictive validity, which is a large difference between those that went on to copy the violence and those that did not. And but there's also a study by Goodwill and Malloy, which found a lack of differences between non-attackers and attackers. Actually, the proximal warning behavior dimension was able to differentiate the other ones, and the total score was not. So in terms of predictive validity, kind of all over the place, sometimes extremely high, which could indicate overfitting. So this is really, we'll have to wait for more studies to come out to have a better picture what is going on. For content and convergent validity, what we see is that author felt that violent extremism risk tools effectively measured the main risk-relevant propensities and activities of individual on violent extremism trajectories. So they covered well the content that they should have been covering. And the rare studies that tested the convergence between violent extremism risk tools indicated that the correlation between the scores on these tools was quite high, which should be the case if their content is also similar. And when we look at the content of different violent extremism risk tools, we kind of find the same risk factors. Nobody reinvented the wheel, should I say. As I've alluded to, threats to validity are substantial. So first of all of the VE risk tools on which there are studies were developed before the first meta-analysis of risk and protective factors in the VE field came out. So I'm namely thinking about the Wolfowitz studies, which came out in, if my memory serves me right, 2019 and 2020. So all risk tools were developed before that, which means that they may rely on evidence that can be challenged in some ways. And the most important findings, no, not the most important finding, but one of the important findings was that except for 3 studies, all of them were conducted on samples constituted through the triangulation of publicly available data, which is, well, not the most robust way to constitute a sample. If you wanted to go like upper the echelon, you could have a sample that is constituted through, let's say, official records. And then if you wanted to go over that, you could have official records and interviews with participants. And then at the top, you would have interviews, records, and a pre-post measure in a true prospective study design. But most of them were done in a retrospective design and with convenience samples. There are numerous case studies of one participants, which are mostly about content validity. So these studies are worthwhile. However, they do not really tell us if a tool predicts what it is supposed to predict. And the most important finding is that we still have a complete lack of study of predictive validity study that uses a prospective design, which would be like the gold standard for validating a risk tool. So unfortunately, there was none at the moment this review was done. Well, and we wholeheartedly hope that some will come in the later years. And in this context, it is kind of strange to see. I've looking through the abstract of the included papers to prepare myself for the seminar and the Stockholm one that I did. I went through some abstract, and one of them contained a sentence like, considering that the predictive validity of the TRAP-18 is established, then we did blah, blah, blah. And it's like, that is maybe a little ambitious to conclude that the predictive validity of the TRAP-18 has been established. We have indices that it could be good, but to be sure that it is actually established, we would have to have a prospective design in which we find that the TRAP-18 actually is able to predict acting out, violent radicalized acting out of individuals on violent radical trajectories. And as I've said multiple times, predictive validity is the most important validation criterion as it relates to risk scales. We have yet no studies that really attest to the predictive validity of risk tools as of now. And of course, here I'm being critical. Some would say overly critical. Some would say not enough critical, because it's basically the thing of doing a systematic review to be critical of what you find rather than actually doing the validation studies yourself. So I'm doing a little bit of a self-ridicule here. But what we have to remember is that actually imperfect data is better than no data at all. Tools that for which the authors actually try to validate their stuff, even if it's not yet done, and we're just starting to put together the pieces of a nomological network, it's still better than just a tool that claims to be the best thing since sliced bread, on which there are actually no validation data. So even though I'm being critical, actually kudos to those that go through the validation process, as it is a hard endeavor. As we're slowly moving towards the conclusion, we are aware that restricting the publication date to 2021 and under means that many newer studies were not included, and we made a kind of search to see if what has been published since then is important, and some of them are. There are pretty big studies that came out after 2021 as it relates to risk tool validation. There's namely the Corner and Taylor 2023 report, which is titled Testing the Reliability, Validity, and Equity of Terrorism Risk Assessment Instruments, which is kind of a big one in length and scope. So there's that. There's Elliott and colleagues in 2023, which made an exploratory psychometric analysis of the ERG-22+, but this is a study with factor analysis, confirmatory factor analysis, item response theory, so kind of big stat stuff. So there are important studies that were published after our end date of data collection. However, these studies do not affect our main conclusion, which is that there are still no prospective predictive validity studies of violent extremism risk tools, and there should be. So what is the take-home messages of all of this? In terms of general conclusions, there are no tools that can be recommended as the gold standard, as all have significant flaws as it relates to their validation, namely the lack of predictive validity established through prospective designs. The TRAP-18 is by far the tool that has the most vibrant scientific community, but it still lacks essential validation, as I have said. There are some methodologically strong studies that are starting to come out about the ERG-22+ in the later years. However, going back to our question, can we recommend a tool for a specific context, for a specific audience? We cannot really, because the level of psychometric validation of tools kind of precludes us from recommending them or anyone in specific. However, in terms of audiences, what is interesting is that, as mentioned, tools were much more ideologically agnostic than expected, at least in their validation. So tools were validated with individuals that adhered to various ideology. It was not excessively centered on religiously inspired radicalization or on the far right or on for the far left or anything. It was really kind of varied. It's surprisingly varied, I would say. And these kind of fit with new findings in the VE field that namely the Wolfowick studies, which emphasize that the risk and predictive factors are also kind of ideology agnostic. So there's that. In terms of future research, well, the usual after all systematic reviews and meta-analyses that were ever published ever, more, better research is needed, of course. And I could go kind of a long way in how better research is needed. We need research on how radicalization manifests itself in women, and can we assess that with any amount of certainty? We have to do cross-cultural validation of scales and blah, blah, blah. So I could go on like a long time, but if there is one take-home message in terms of research, and you, of course, know it because you've listened to the rest of what I say, is that prospective designs with non-convenient samples are urgently needed. And we could go beyond this recommendation and make a bunch of recommendations and hope for up-to-date, great case formulation tools and stuff. But before all of that, we have to at least have one study in which predictive validity is established prospectively with a true clinical sample. However, that does not mean that all of the risk tools in the field should be thrown in the trash. Absolutely not. Even though we cannot recommend the use of a tool as gold standard or for a context, we do recommend using tools as guidelines to structure clinical reflections and assessments. So if we look at the main conclusion of more than 100 years of research on unstructured clinical judgment versus structured approaches in risk assessment in the field of criminology, is that if assessors or clinicians use the good risk and protective factors, disregard the irrelevant factors, so those not empirically linked to the outcome, and assess all cases reliably with the same factors, then clinical judgment or structured clinical judgments is just as good as actuarial prediction. So in that context, the available risk tools could be used to structure clinical reflection and assessments, which would likely lead to better assessments than straight up not using any tools and just relying on one's intuition and judgment, also known as unstructured clinical judgment. So yeah, that is it. Thanks for listening, and let's hope I'm not going to get too panned in the question session.
Thank you, Sebastian. That was amazing. We got a lot of questions. I hope we will be able to answer a few of them at least. Let me start from the first one. So I will merge a couple of questions about the fact that you noted that most studies, if not all actually, were retrospective. So why is that a problem? And how can we think of doing prospective predictive validity designs that can be ethically feasible in the counterterrorism space?
Mm-hmm. So retrospective studies means that, for example, you have a database with a bunch of variables, and then you know if these persons went on to commit radicalized violence or not, and then you respectively code your TRAP-18 based on, or whatever other tool, based on the variables that exist in the database, and then you're trying to predict an outcome that is, let's be honest, already known and already present in the database, which can lead to overfitting. And namely, one of the things that is kind of known in risk tool validation is when you're doing risk tool validation, the second you adopt a prospective design, all of your effect sizes drop, because it's, as some people have said, it is much harder to predict stuff when that stuff is actually in the future. So when I'm saying prospective design, one way to do that would just be to, for example, if you're, let's say you're the Correctional Service of Canada, and then you have a bunch of persons that are presently in supervised community release or incarcerated, then you can test drive a tool. So as part of their initial assessment or later in the incarceration process assessment, then you score the tool. And then these persons eventually get released in the community. And then for 5 years, you see if they went on to commit radicalized violence, or if they went back into their radicalized group or not, or if they committed another criminal recidivism act or anything. So you start to collect data while the person is incarcerated or under community supervision, and then you look in the future 5 years, did that person actually went on to commit a crime? When I made my assessment of the VERA or whatever, and then VERA said, oh, high risk, this one is at high risk, well, did the person actually went on to commit radicalized violence in the future? So this is the way to do a true prospective study. And theoretically, it's not like treatment, which has a lot of ethical concerns in the field. So you cannot, for example, in criminology or in my other expertise, which is sexual violence, you obviously cannot do a randomized controlled trial of a sexual violence prevention program, because that means withholding intervention from people that actually want it, So if these persons go on to commit violence, then you don't really look good as a researcher. So, but since this is risk assessment tool validation, then there's not really any ethical concern associated to specifically to the fact of doing a prospective study.
Sébastien, can I ask you something? One question is very Australian focused, and ask if you found anything about radar, which is one of the CV risk assessment tools used in Victoria.
Yeah, so that is a big one, because in our search strategy, what I have not talked a lot about, we had like an overall search string about risk assessment tools for violent radicalization, but then we also just made a list of all the tools that were known and entered the name of these tools in the search string one by one, and also in the gray literature reports. And one of the things that one of the comments that we receive is that, yeah, is there anything about the radar? And at first we thought that we had like forgotten it or something, but no, there's just nothing on the radar. And there's also, I think, one of the thing that we found in the post 2021 Gray Lit search, to be sure that newer articles didn't contradict our findings. We also found I think, a really good literature review, and that literature review checked at the radar, and there is still nothing. And I think that, if my memory serves me right, the Corner and Taylor report, they do a really thorough literature review about a bunch of tools, one of which is the radar. And there's, to my knowledge and to the knowledge of multiple other researchers, nothing on the radar. But maybe I could be wrong, but we've checked for that. We've confirmed that. So we were asked, is there really nothing on the radar? And we checked, and the answer was, to our knowledge, no, at least.
Thanks, Sébastien. You also made a objection to the claim that TRAP-18 has demonstrated predictive validity. Can you elaborate a little bit on that? So what is your view on that? Do we have this predictive validity or not?
My view is that to claim predictive validity, you would have to have at least one prospective study in which an adequate prediction value is found. Because all of the studies on the TRAP-18 were done in a retrospective coding, and a retrospective coding of cases that result through the triangulation of publicly available data, so publicly available terrorist database. I don't think that this would qualify as having demonstrated predictive validity. It's more about having demonstrated that the tool can discriminate between people that already went on to commit violent radical acts or already went on to not commit such acts. But this is more in the discriminant validity space than the predictive one, because to have predictive validity, and predictive is kind of in the name, you have to have prospective designs to really attest to that.
What's your view on using methods like, entering the coding blindly or blindly reviewers about the outcome in the retrospective validity, so they do not know, if you anonymize and make blind the reviewers on the outcomes of a case? Can we use a method like that, for example? What are your views?
Yes, and it was done in some studies. I don't necessarily remember which one, but in some studies, I think it was about the ERG, if my memory serves me right. They took 50 cases among all those reviewed by the government, and they made vignettes, clinical vignettes with those, and in those they blinded some aspects that would enable for example, recognizing the person that did the act because it was mediatized, but also blinding the outcome. And I think that is good practice. If you give a clinical vignette to somebody and the assessor knows the outcome, for example, the person went on to commit some radicalized violence, the assessor is going to find reason to reach a higher risk verdict. so actually blinding if that person went on or not to commit violence is a good, I would say, is good practice.
That's fantastic. Thank you, Sébastien. Look, we are a little bit over time already, so I apologize to everyone if I have not been able to pose all your questions, but thank you, Sébastien, for your time. The video of this webinar will be available on the AVERT website, www.avert.net.au. Please feel free to join the mailing list to find out about future events, and follow us on LinkedIn and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Well, thanks again, Sébastien. It's been fantastic, this webinar, and I hope we will be able to have the opportunity to host you in Australia sometimes soon.
Well, I would love to come. Thanks for having me.